I found this pine bed headboard or footboard, I'm not sure which. It was left by some bins near my house and the front of it had a decorative pattern routed into it, but the back was just plain and I thought the plain side would make a good top for a coffee table. I started by measuring the length and then cutting the piece in half so that I could use one half of it for the tabletop and one half for a shelf. The piece was a little bit too wide to fit on my table saw, so I ended up raising the blade of my table saw through the wood and then lowering it to the right cutting depth. Then I set up a rip fence on the table saw and cut each piece into a rectangle. Then I sanded down each piece with a belt sander. I used a 60 grit paper for this to quickly cut through the old varnish. For the table legs, I had two bits of 2x4. I think these came from an old industrial pallet, and I cut them on the table saw to make 4 legs of equal width and depth. Then I cut all of the legs to length using the crosscut sled on my table saw. You can see some old nail holes in this wood, but I wasn't too worried about those because most of them won't be visible once I've routed out the dado joints for the stretchers. There'll probably be a few nail holes still visible once the table is finished, but I think that adds to the character. With the legs finished, I looked through my wood collection to find something I could use for the stretchers. I found these pine bed slats that I thought would be ideal. I'd found these by a bin as well, but they weren't from the same bed as the headboard. I marked up where the dado joints would need to be cut in the legs to hold each stretcher. I wanted the dado joints in the centre of the leg. I didn't measure for accuracy, I just did this by eye. Then I used a set square to mark up where the shelf would go. Then I used my plunge router to make the dado joints. I did this by hand using the guide on the router. It's not particularly accurate and one day hopefully I'll have a router table to use. And once the joints were cut, I used a test piece to check they were a good fit. Then I routed out the joint for the shelf. And used a chisel to square off the joint. Then I did a bit more sanding using an orbital sander with a 120 grit paper. Then it was time to assemble. I just used an ordinary PVA wood glue for this. You can see a band clamp on the floor. I was going to use this to hold the legs to the shelf while the glue dried, but I don't get on too well with band clamps, so I ended up using bar clamps instead. Once the glue had dried on the shelf, it was time to glue in the stretchers. I was making this table as a gift for my parents, and I wanted to match the colour of the table to their other furniture, which was a light oak colour, so I bought this light oak stain. I also bought this white dye so that I could lighten the stain, and an acrylic varnish too, because I read that this is the only varnish that you can use on pine that won't darken the colour of the wood over time. And then I tested out different combinations of the stain, the dye and the varnish on scrap pieces of pine until I found a decent colour match. Then I sanded down the frame with an orbital sander and a 120 grit paper. Before applying a finish to the table, I sprayed it with water and wiped it down just to get rid of any sawdust. Then I mixed the stain, the dye and the varnish again, using the same quantities I'd used for the test piece. It looked like a weak cup of tea. Then I used my trusty washing up glove and old sock combo for applying the finish. And this is the tabletop of the frame once the finish had dried. Then I brushed on another coat of the acrylic varnish. Then I sanded down that coat with a 600 grit wet and dry paper, and then applied one final coat. I used this cheap pocket hole jig to make some holes to attach the top to the frame. Then I applied some Titebond wood glue. And tried to position the top as central to the frame as possible, just using my fingers as a guide, and then used drywall screws to attach the frame to the top.